The second person I wrote about, her name was Carol Morrison. She and her husband, Rocky, run a soybean and corn farm in a small town outside of Peoria. And they were there raising their kids and raising their crops and having a good life. And then one of their neighbors announced that he was going to open a mega dairy farm with several thousand dairy cattle just about a mile down the road from their property. And the community was very concerned about this, and they organized and they tried to stop it. But the guy, who was not a farmer at all, he was actually an ex-executive at Caterpillar, which has offices in Peoria, and he decided he was going to open this dairy farm. People begged him not to. Karen begged him not to. He went ahead and did it anyway. And he dug this 11,000-gallon lagoon to hold all the waste from his cattle. He built earthen berms around it, and then he would go out and spray. Well, in February of one year, the ground was frozen, and you cannot spray when the ground is frozen because it won't absorb the waste. It'll just run off. And so he went several weeks without being able to spray, and there was a lot of rain and a lot of snow that year, and his lagoon, as they're called, started rising and rising and rising. And around the edge of the lagoon is a berm which is called the freeboard, and typically you're supposed to have about 3 feet of freeboard to protect the lagoon from spilling over. Well, the rain kept coming, he kept dumping waste in the lagoon, and sure enough, the berm broke. And tens of thousands of gallons of wastewater spilled into a creek, then went into the Illinois River, and eventually made its way into the Mississippi River. And Karen started a group called, a great name for a group, Families Against Rural Messes, or FARM. And she is now today one of the leading activists against factory farming. And again, her community and the local environment was devastated by this one guy who decided he was going to make money out of putting thousands and thousands of dairy cows into one place. The third person I wrote about also was dealing with dairy issues. Her name is Helen Redout. She lives in Yakima Valley in Washington State. She's a cherry farmer. If you've ever been to Yakima Valley, it's a beautiful place, lots of orchards, lots of fruit trees. And all of a sudden, these mega dairies started opening up in the valley. And it turns out, interestingly enough, they were all Dutch dairy farmers who had to leave the Netherlands for this very reason, because Holland is so small, there's only so much waste that the land can absorb. So these dairy farmers were bought out by the government just to get out of business, and they all moved to California. But when property values and taxes started going up in California, they put their eyes on Yakima Valley, and one by one, they all started moving to Yakima Valley. And I went to all these places, of course, and I actually visited Yakima Valley both in the summer and in the winter. And when you go there in the winter, these dairy farms, a lot of dairy farms, the cows are kept inside barns. Most of these animals never ever see the light of day. In Yakima Valley, they're outside. And in the wintertime, when it rains and snows, these cows live in mud, and they live in their own feces. And you could see it coating their udders, and they're completely coated in basically their own crap. In the summer, when they defecate, it dries out on the land. And when they run on it, they grind it up. And when the winds come, they pick it up. And I saw this. I remember driving down a road when the wind picked up, and it blew this stuff into the road, and it became so dark and so dense you had to turn the headlights on to see where you were going. And you are literally breathing ground feces. The air is so foul there, at times you can't even go outside. And I remember returning home from Yakima Valley with what they call manure flu. And your sinuses are infected, you're coughing, you have a sore throat, your eyes are watering. And I remember coming home and opening up my suitcase, and I got this whiff of cow manure, because that's how concentrated it is in the atmosphere there. The other person I wrote about, her name is Carol Morrison, and she owned chicken farms in Maryland on the Delmarva Peninsula. which is home to Purdue Chicken, as you probably know. And they produce so much chicken litter that they can't get rid of it. And again, when it rains, a lot of those nutrients wash into Chesapeake Bay, which has serious problems with algae blooms and fish kills. And Carol's story was particularly interesting because she was a factory farmer. They decided to get into the business, and the way these companies operate, Purdue, Tyson, Cargill, ADM, they contract these growers, but they dictate exactly how to raise the animals. So Purdue told Carol exactly what was going to go into the feed, exactly how much water, exactly how many chickens, and they would start with chicks, and then in 8 weeks, they're harvested, if you will. And these chickens are just crammed in, and the workers come and they scoop them up by the feet and throw them into cages and ship them off for processing. Every so often, there would be some stragglers left behind. A lot of the chickens died. They get so big they can't even support their own weight. Their breasts become so large. They often have cardiac arrest and die. Well, whether a chicken died or not, Carol was not allowed to eat the chickens that she was raising. If they wanted to eat a Purdue chicken, they had to get in the car, go down to the supermarket, and buy one at the same price that everybody else was, because those chickens belonged to the company, not to her. And they would work their asses off and maybe make a couple of $1,000s per chicken house, each house having maybe 10,000 chickens. Where Purdue was reaping all the profits, they were suffering, and they were making very, very little money, and they had absolutely no control over how they raised their animals. This is called integrated farming. The companies own these animals. They call it from semen to cellophane. So from the time they're bred and born and raised and slaughtered and processed and put into packaging and sold in the supermarket, that company controls that entire chain. And they have lots of power. These companies donate millions of dollars a year to political candidates who support their interests. They're backed up by the United States Farm Bureau. Farm Bureau is probably the most powerful lobby. We think of NRA, we think of other powerful lobbies. Farm Bureau has an office in just about every county in the United States. They have offices in every state capital. They have offices in Washington, D.C. Incredibly powerful lobby. They buy politicians, they pay them off, and it's extremely difficult even now to get local regulations to stop this type of pollution that comes from these factory farms. And it's a serious problem. Now, the impact on the environment, as I mentioned and as I found, can be devastating. We'll start with air. I mentioned just the smell that can be so overpowering you want to vomit. Well, that smell is hydrogen sulfide, and it's what you think it is. It's, when you have gas and it stinks, that's because of hydrogen sulfide. And it just gets emitted from these lagoons in huge amounts. They also emit methane, and as we know, methane is a major contributor to global warming. It's a greenhouse gas. It's also extremely deadly. Every so often there's a case of a farmer who goes into the barn and maybe the fans don't work, there's a power outage, and they will die. There's horrible stories about, I remember one in Virginia, and then the farmer went to see, I guess there was a pipe that was broken in the waste pit beneath the animals, and he tried to fix it and was instantly overcome by methane, fell into the muck. His son came to help him. He eventually, you can imagine, just one family member after another, I think 8 people died that day just from the methane in that concentrated area. Well, that methane also gets released into the atmosphere. And then there is huge amounts of ammonia. And ammonia, of course, is largely made of nitrates and nitrogen. And you get these ammonia clouds that can rise up out of these lagoons, and they can travel up to 50 miles away before they're finally deposited, usually in waterways. And then that turns into nitrates, which then leads, it's too many nutrients for the water to handle, and then you get these algae blooms, which suck all the air, the oxygen out of the water, and leads to massive fish kills. So even though they're polluting the air around them, they're actually also contributing to polluting the water. And then there's just the pathogens in this waste, and particularly in chicken and hog farms. They have giant fans at the end of these long barns, and those fans work 24 hours a day to move all of this stuff out of the barns. If those fans were to break down, all of the animals would die very quickly, and any people in that barn would die quickly. So they're basically just spewing 24 hours a day, not only ammonia and methane and sulfur dioxide, but also all kinds of pathogens. And that's why people get these flu-like symptoms living downwind from these areas. And I visited so many people that could no longer enjoy their backyard. The smell and the illnesses that they were getting were so severe that, and it was unpredictable. It depends on which way the wind is blowing, if the wind is blowing. So I might get to somebody's house and they would actually be apologetic because, like, oh, it doesn't stink right now. We invited you over to smell, what things are like. But within maybe an hour, the wind would shift, and sure enough, you could not be outside. And you are literally breathing in not only those chemicals and gases, but very dangerous pathogens.